reminding you of everything she has endured. The original issue, your concern, vanishes. Instead of resolving conflict, you find yourself apologizing for bringing it up in the first place. This dynamic trains you. You begin to anticipate her emotional reactions and soften your words. Then you start filtering your feelings. Eventually, you stop voicing them altogether, not because they don't matter, but because addressing them costs too much emotionally. The relationship becomes centered on stabilizing her mood rather than addressing mutual needs. What makes this especially powerful is the moral positioning. She frames herself as sensitive, empathetic, or deeply wounded. So when you feel frustrated, guilt creeps in. You question whether you're being too harsh, too demanding, too insensitive. Meanwhile, accountability never lands. There is always an explanation, a justification, or someone else to blame. Over time, you may notice that the common denominator in every dramatic story, every broken friendship, every workplace conflict is her. Yet she remains the perpetual victim in each narrative, and you slowly become the next character cast in that role without even realizing it. The second sign, image is everything, can be especially disorienting because the woman you experience in private may be completely different from the woman the world sees. Publicly, she is polished, charismatic, socially skilled. People describe her as kind, generous, even inspiring. She knows how to read a room. She understands optics. She curates how others perceive her with remarkable precision. But in private, something shifts. The warmth may cool. The empathy feels selective. Your vulnerabilities, which she once seemed to treasure, may later be dismissed or even used against you. The discrepancy between her public persona and private behavior leaves you confused. When you try to explain your concerns to others, they struggle to reconcile your experience with the person they know. For someone with narcissistic traits, reputation is emotional oxygen. Being admired, envied, or seen as morally superior regulates their fragile self-esteem. Criticism, even mild feedback, threatens that carefully constructed image. That's why disagreements often escalate quickly. Not because the issue is large, but because any suggestion of fault feels like exposure. You may also notice how much energy goes into appearances. Social media presentation, curated stories about the relationship, performative affection in front of others. The relationship can start to feel like a brand rather than a bond. Your role becomes supporting the narrative rather than living authentically within it. Over time, you might feel invisible in your own relationship. Your private reality doesn't match the public script. And because the outside world validates her image, you may begin doubting your perception. That tension between what you experience and what everyone else sees slowly erodes your confidence and keeps you silent. The third sign, emotional invalidation disguised as sensitivity, is subtle, and that's what makes it so destabilizing. On the surface, she may describe herself as deeply emotional, intuitive, even empathic. She may say she feels things more intensely than others, and in the beginning, that depth can feel intimate and meaningful. You might even admire how expressive she is. But watch what happens when your emotions enter the room. If you share that you're hurt, disappointed, or overwhelmed, the response often redirects back to her emotional experience. She may say you're overreacting. She may claim your tone was aggressive. She may insist that your feelings are based on a misunderstanding. The conversation becomes less about understanding you and more about defending herself. Sometimes the invalidation is subtle. A sigh, an eye roll, a sarcastic wow. Other times it's framed as helpful insight. You're just insecure. You're too sensitive. You always take things the wrong way. These statements chip away at your confidence in your own emotional reality. What makes it confusing is that she can be highly expressive about her own feelings. When she's upset, the expectation is immediate understanding and accommodation. When you're upset, the bar shifts. Your emotions are inconvenient, exaggerated, or somehow unfair to her. Over time, this dynamic creates self-doubt. You begin second-guessing whether you're justified in feeling hurt. You rehearse conversations in your head before bringing them up. You minimize your reactions to avoid being labeled dramatic or unstable. The imbalance is quiet but powerful. Her emotional world is treated as complex and valid, while yours is reduced, reframed, or dismissed. And when your feelings are consistently invalidated, you don't just lose arguments, you slowly lose trust in yourself. The fourth sign, subtle competition, doesn't look like open rivalry. It's quieter than that. It shows up in tone shifts, backhanded compliments, and moments that should feel celebratory but somehow leave you uneasy. Instead of your success being shared joy, it becomes a comparison point. When something good happens to you, a promotion, praise, a personal achievement, watch her reaction closely. Does she seem genuinely happy, or does the energy change? Does she quickly redirect the spotlight back to herself? Maybe she brings up her own accomplishment or reminds you of something she sacrificed or subtly minimizes what you achieved. That's nice, but becomes a familiar phrase. Envy is difficult for anyone to admit, but in someone with narcissistic traits, it can feel threatening. Your growth may unconsciously challenge her need to feel superior or central. If your confidence rises, her control weakens. So the dynamic may shift toward keeping you slightly off balance. Through teasing that feels a little sharp, comparisons to others, or highlighting your flaws at moments when you feel strong. Over time, you may find yourself shrinking your wins. You stop sharing exciting news immediately. You downplay your achievements to avoid tension. You might even hesitate to pursue opportunities because success seems to create distance or conflict. The competition can also extend socially. If others compliment you, she may interrupt, correct, or subtly undermine, not in a dramatic way, just enough to reassert dominance. It's rarely overt hostility. It's strategic diminishment. Healthy relationships amplify each other, but when subtle competition becomes a pattern, the relationship stops feeling like a partnership and starts feeling like a quiet contest where only one person is allowed to shine. The fifth sign, intermittent warmth, is often the most addictive and the hardest to walk away from. She is not cold all the time. In fact, when she is loving, she can be extraordinary. Attentive, affectionate, magnetic. Those moments feel intense and real, and they remind you why you stayed in the first place. But the warmth is inconsistent. One week she is deeply connected, future planning, emotionally present. The next she is distant, irritated, unavailable. There may be no clear trigger. You search your mind for what changed. Did you say something wrong? Did you miss something? The unpredictability keeps you hyper-focused on her mood. This pattern creates what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. When affection is unpredictable, it becomes more powerful. You work harder for it. You become more patient, more accommodating, more self-sacrificing, hoping to return to the good phase. The relationship starts to feel like chasing sunlight between storms. When she withdraws, she may blame stress, your behavior, or vague dissatisfaction. When she returns with warmth, it feels like relief. That relief bonds you more tightly than steady affection ever could. You begin measuring the relationship not by stability, but by intensity. Over time, your nervous system adapts to the chaos. Calm feels unfamiliar. You equate unpredictability with passion, and because she occasionally shows you the loving version of herself, you cling to the belief that if you just try harder, communicate better, or prove yourself more fully, that version will stay. But consistent love does not require guessing games. When affection is used, consciously or unconsciously, as a reward and withdrawal as a punishment, the relationship stops being secure and starts becoming a cycle you are constantly trying to win. The sixth sign, gaslighting and narrative rewriting, is where confusion becomes chronic. It doesn't always happen in explosive arguments. Often, it unfolds in small, quiet distortions of reality that accumulate over time. You remember a conversation clearly. She said something sharp. You felt dismissed. When you bring it up later, she insists it never happened that way. She tells you you're misremembering. She says you're twisting her words. She may even look genuinely offended that you would interpret it that way. The certainty in her tone makes you pause. At first, you assume it's a misunderstanding. Everyone recalls things differently, but the pattern repeats. Your version of events is consistently challenged. Her version always positions her as reasonable and you as reactive. Over time, you begin second-guessing your own memory. You replay conversations in your head, trying to check your accuracy. You might even start apologizing for things you're no longer sure you did wrong. Narrative rewriting goes beyond single incidents. It reshapes the history of the relationship. She may claim she was always supportive when you remember criticism. She may say you were distant when you recall trying desperately to connect. The story shifts to maintain her innocence and preserve control. What makes this so destabilizing is the erosion of internal trust. When you can't rely on your own perception, you become more dependent on hers. She becomes the authority on what is real, what is valid, what is acceptable. And once that happens, the power imbalance deepens. Because if she controls the story, she controls the meaning. And if she controls the meaning, she controls how you see yourself within it. The seventh sign, conditional love and approval tied to control, can feel subtle at first because it doesn't arrive as an obvious demand. It arrives as preference, as standards, as expectations framed as care. She may say she just wants the best for you. She may describe her reactions as motivation. But over time, you begin to notice that warmth and approval are directly connected to how well you align with her needs. When you agree with her, support her, prioritize her, the relationship feels smooth. She is affectionate, affirming, engaged. You feel valued. But when you assert independence, when you set a boundary, disagree, or focus on your own priorities, the temperature changes, the distance creeps in, the tone sharpens, the approval evaporates. Love begins to feel earned rather than given. You might find yourself adjusting your behavior to stay in her good graces. You check your words before speaking. You avoid topics that trigger withdrawal. You prioritize her preferences to avoid conflict. Slowly, your autonomy shrinks. Not because she explicitly forbade it, but because the emotional cost of independence feels too high. Control doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like selective affection. When approval becomes a reward and disapproval becomes a form of punishment, the relationship shifts from mutual connection to behavioral conditioning. Over time, this dynamic erodes your authenticity. You may struggle to remember what you actually want versus what keeps the peace. And because the approval feels so good when you receive it, you may ignore how unstable it truly is. Healthy love remains steady even when there is disagreement. But when affection depends on compliance, the bond becomes less about connection and more about control. The eighth sign, chronic need for external validation, often sits beneath all the other patterns. It is the engine driving the image management, the victimhood, the competition, the gaslighting. At the core, there is an unstable sense of self that constantly needs reinforcement from the outside. She may crave admiration in obvious ways, fishing for compliments, highlighting achievements, curating how others perceive her, but it can also appear more subtly. She may need to be the most attractive in the room, the most wronged in a conflict, the most insightful in a discussion. Attention, sympathy, praise, these become forms of emotional fuel. What makes this challenging in a relationship is that your role slowly shifts into regulator. You become the source of reassurance. If she feels insecure, you must soothe it. If she feels overlooked, you must elevate her. If she feels criticized, you must repair it. And if you fail to provide that validation consistently, tension builds. The relationship can start to revolve around stabilizing her self-esteem. Compliments become expected rather than appreciated. Support becomes mandatory rather than mutual. And if you are going through something yourself, stress, loss, self-doubt, there may be little room for your needs because her validation requirements take priority. Over time, you may feel emotionally drained without fully understanding why. It's exhausting to be someone's primary mirror, especially when no amount of reassurance ever truly satisfies the underlying insecurity. The tragedy is that external validation is never enough to create internal stability. So the cycle continues. More attention, more admiration, more reassurance. And in that cycle, your energy becomes a resource that is constantly consumed but rarely replenished. In conclusion, recognizing these signs is not about labeling or judging. It's about clarity and self-preservation. Women with narcissistic traits can be charming, engaging, and even deeply loving at times. But persistent patterns like weaponized victimhood, image obsession, emotional invalidation, subtle competition, intermittent warmth, gaslighting, conditional love, and chronic need for external validation reveal a dynamic that erodes trust, autonomy, and emotional well-being. Awareness is the first step toward breaking free from confusion and self-doubt. When you can identify these behaviors, you reclaim your perspective, your boundaries, and your power. You begin to distinguish genuine connection from manipulation, and you stop questioning your own reality. The truth is, no one should have to adjust, silence, or shrink themselves to maintain another person's approval or emotional equilibrium. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, consistency, and empathy, not cycles of unpredictability, guilt, and validation seeking. By understanding these patterns, you equip yourself to make conscious choices about how much energy, time, and trust